Good evening, everyone. Hello. Welcome to Balliol. My name is Dan Butt. I'm one of the politics fellows here. And it's my great pleasure to welcome you to the 2023 Omar Azfar Lecture on social justice. So we have this lecture every year in honor of Omar Azfar. Omar was a PPE student here who had a great commitment to social justice. And we're delighted that we're able to put this on event each year in his honor. We're particularly delighted to welcome some of his friends and family here today, including Sarah, his sister. So you're very welcome. Nice to see you. And thank you all very much for coming. It's my great pleasure to introduce our speaker for today, Professor Lawrie Balfour. Lawrie is this year the John G. Winant Visiting Professor of American Government here in Oxford and indeed here in Balliol. But occasionally she does other things in her day job, and so she's also the James Hart Professor of Politics at the University of Virginia. She's a hugely distinguished political theorist who studies, amongst other things, questions in race, gender, democracy, and literature with a focus on African-American political thought. She's especially interested in investigating the relationship between the legacies of slavery and democratic possibilities in the US. And she's the author of 3 books: The Evidence of Things Not Said, James Baldwin and the Promise of American Democracy, Democracy's Reconstruction, Thinking Politically with W.E. Du Bois, and Toni Morrison, Imagining Freedom, which we see here in front of us. And it's that book on Toni Morrison which is going to be in part the subject of Lawrie's talk today. So it's a great pleasure to welcome you, and we look forward very much to hearing your talk. Lawrie.
I want to begin today by thanking Sudhir Hazare and Dan Butt for the invitation to give this year's Omar Azfar Lecture. It's been wonderful to be at Balliol, and it's particularly an honor to be part of this really inspiring tradition. I had a chance to take a look at one of the previous lectures and to see the list of some of the prior lectures, and it's daunting, but it is also really very special to be able to be part of it. Today's talk is drawn from my recent book entitled Imagining Freedom, Toni Morrison and the Work of Words, as Dan just said, which troubles the traditional study of freedom in political theory and philosophy. Freedom is, of course, one of the most inspiring words in our political lexicon. It is also one of the most trivialized, overused, and misunderstood words. And it has a special place in the United States, a democratic society founded on both the defense of liberty and the right to enslave. The ease with which cries of freedom have been enlisted to justify the massive theft of non-white labor, land, and lives on the one hand, and the passion with which cries of freedom have undergirded struggles against oppression on the other, indicate why debates about freedom matter and point to the limits of conventional political theorizing. Where should we look for conceptions of freedom not reducible to white freedom? What would be required to imagine forms of personal and collective liberty that do not depend on the subjugation of others? Excluding race from consideration, as political theorists often do, might yield a concept that is compelling in the abstract and yet largely irrelevant to the ways in which the concept is lived in a racially hierarchical society. My contention is that Toni Morrison's writing provides a powerful alternative. Her novels and her nonfiction grapple in profound ways with what it would mean to get or to be free in the shadow of slavery and colonial rule. When Morrison says that the function of freedom is to free somebody else, she goes beyond offering a definition. Using her distinctive gifts as a storyteller, she vivifies the experience of freedom and unfreedom from the vantage of people who know its price because they cannot take it for granted. Crucially, Morrison's quest to re-inhabit the lives of the enslaved and their descendants locates her in a long tradition of thought, art, action, and practice that is animated by a desire to articulate Black ways of being free. Morrison dedicated her career to investigating how American English, the language of her inheritance, could be refashioned to capture the experiences of women, men, and children who were, in her words, disremembered and unaccounted for. Born in Lorain, Ohio in 1931, Morrison traces her lineage to migrants from the U.S. South whose analysis of American life includes both her grandfather's unreconstructed pessimism and her grandmother's capacity to discern the glimmers of irrevocable and permanent change. While she's best known as the author of 11 novels and the recipient of multiple awards, most notably the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1993, Morrison pursued the possibility of freer and more equal ways of life across multiple overlapping careers. She was a teacher at many universities and colleges, an editor whose deep appreciation for the importance of canon making reconstituted American literature as a field capacious enough to encompass the novels of Toni Cade-Bambara and Gail Jones, the poetry of Lucille Clifton and June Jordan, the autobiographies of Muhammad Ali, Huey Newton, and Angela Davis, and the words of many more artists, activists, and scholars. Morrison was a prolific reviewer and an acute literary and social critic whose commentaries went to the core of the knottiest questions of her time. My talk today focuses on one dimension of Morrison's work as a novelist and political thinker, her understanding of freedom as a modern concept. In an interview with Paul Gilroy in the late 1980s, Morrison remarked, quote, "Modern life begins with slavery," close quote. This claim is historical in a particular sense. Morrison is not interested in debates about periodization, and her writing discloses the complexity faced by precise starting points and endings, and unsettles linear histories. Instead, she raises questions about how the transport of approximately 12.5 million people from Africa to the Western Hemisphere between the 15th century and the latter part of the 19th century shaped the emergence of modern life. Morrison's statement demands that we pay attention to stories that are typically silent in canonical works of modern political thought, where slavery and colonial expansion provide a largely unexamined context out of which figures like John Locke, Thomas Jefferson, and John Stuart Mill articulate new conceptions of freedom. Morrison's fiction opens up the possibility of pondering what it could have meant for the enslaved, and for women in particular, to experience the wholesale replacement of their known world with one that was entirely new to them, and in different ways new to the Europeans who declared that Africans were property. Becoming modern, in Morrison's view, was a matter of necessity for women and men of African descent. From the beginning of the Atlantic slave trade, they were confronted with what she calls the dissolution and the madness of white mastery, which gave rise to an unspeakable range of predatory Western phenomena. Crucially, Morrison's comment is offered in the present tense. She insists that modern life begins with slavery. The force of this word "begins" enables her to connect the theft of bodies in the 15th century to the journeys across the Atlantic that followed, to the flight of fugitives and struggles over abolition and independence from colonial rule, to the world wars of the 20th century, and to new forms of destruction in the 21st. Like the New York Times' much debated 1619 project, Morrison's statement provokes a reorientation toward a history that has been unknown or disavowed. Like scholarly arguments such as Mahmoud Mamdani's retelling of political modernity as a colonial project beginning in 1492, rather than with the Treaty of Westphalia in 1648, Morrison's statement is part of an effort to interpret and conceive alternatives to centuries of racialized violence. Like these efforts, furthermore, her writing engages in a rethinking of the present so that readers are provoked to understanding, rather than amazement, by the evidence that the legacies of slavery shape our lives in countless ways today. Morrison's contention that, quote, "slavery broke the world in half, broke it every way," close quote, need not mean that slavery alone accounts for the beginning of modern life and freedom. The larger body of her work tells a complex story that refuses hierarchies of oppression and investigates what Lisa Lowe calls the intimacies that connect the histories of enslaved, colonized, and migrant peoples across the modern world. Over the course of her decades-long career, Morrison's fiction and criticism became increasingly attuned to Americans' attempted erasure of indigenous presence and to the layered dispossessions through which North America and other parts of the world have been converted into private property and national territory in dynamic processes of settler colonialism and enslavement. One of the marvels of Morrison's novel is their capacity to bring modern life to life by limning the moments of its making and remaking and creating characters who inhabit the tensions and contradictions of those moments. Even as they have been sidelined in modern political theory, Black people have imagined and enacted forms of freedom not envisioned by right revolutionaries or philosophers. Approaching modern life from the vantage of the enslaved or dispossessed, the migrant or the forgotten veteran, the domestic worker or the orphaned child opens up new possibilities for understanding what it might take to create a freer existence. To that end, Morrison's novels dwell on the strategies of survival and acts of love that have been and must still be put into action again and again to counter innovative techniques of Western predation. For political theorists, it's helpful to locate Morrison as a distinctive figure in what philosopher Robert Gooding Williams describes as the Afro-modern tradition. And I should apologize in advance. As a political theorist, I have a tendency to have relatively wordy slides. But I think it's helpful to see the language itself, especially Morrison's language. The Afro-modern tradition, in Gooding Williams' view, in sharp contrast to the social contract, French liberal, and most other tendencies of modern political thought, tends to concern itself less with the nation-state per se than with the regimes of white supremacy that have operated apart from or in close alliance with the nation-state. At the same time, Morrison's writing, especially the imaginative dimensions of her writing, exceed Gooding Williams's formulation in ways that make it potentially more illuminating, but also harder to reckon with as political philosophy. In her attunement to enchantment, to the natural and the supernatural, and to forces that defy human aspiration for control or explanation, Morrison exemplifies what Richard Eiton has called the Black fantastic. Eiton defines this as the minor key sensibilities generated from those experiences of the underground, the vagabond, and those constituencies marked as deviant, notions of being that are inevitably aligned within, in conversation with, against, and articulated beyond the boundaries of the modern. Morrison's grasp of history enables her to create textured portraits of racist regimes operating on the plantation, in the ghetto, and in segregated spaces across the United States and beyond. And her capacity to shape language into narrative allows her to venture into characters' interior lives and crystallize the ideas and feelings of people whose stories always exceed the terms of their enslavement or exploitation. What might it mean to approach the liberty of the moderns from the vantage of the women and men Morrison identifies as the first truly modern people? In Benjamin Constant's famous 1819 reflection, what distinguishes the modern from the ancient is a shift from war to commerce as the defining feature of relations among peoples, and ancient practices of political freedom are replaced by the sense, and here I quote Constant, that our freedom must consist of peaceful enjoyment and private independence. Even when this vision of freedom is contrasted with a more actively political, more democratic version in works like Annelien de Dien's magisterial history of freedom, chattel slavery appears as an inconsistency rather than a constitutive feature, and the elimination of indigenous lives does not appear at all. Slavery may be useful as a philosophical counterpoint to liberty, as it is for Republican theorists, for example, or as evidence of modernity's overcoming of the unfreedom of the past. Yet the enslaved and their descendants are rarely invited to offer their own reflections on what freedom means. And little attention is paid to what Simon Gikandi calls the specter of blackness that haunts all attempts to elaborate and valorize the discourse of modern freedom. Where political theoretical arguments largely transpire in what Charles Mills called white time, Morrison dwells in the time of slavery and its aftermath. There are many routes by which to trace the relationship of slavery, freedom, and modern life across Morrison's body of work. And in the remainder of the lecture, I will focus on one novel, A Mercy. Appearing months before Barack Obama's first presidential election in 2008, A Mercy tells the intertwined stories of women, children, and men who inhabited the Atlantic colonies of North America in the 17th century. Although Morrison could not have foreseen Obama's victory, she would not have been surprised by the swiftness with which it was interpreted as a confirmation that the U.S. had entered a post-racial age. When she wrote the novel, after all, the signs of retrenchment were all around her, in judicial hostility to efforts to undo the effects of segregation, in a commitment to colorblindness on the left and the right, and in political attacks on race-conscious policies. The fact that the post-racial era was also a time of devastating racial injustice escaped the notice of too many Americans. Morrison, by contrast, looks to history to understand the present. She situates A Mercy in the period before the passage of laws that tied slavery to race and explores how modern ideas of freedom and modern racial categories were made together. The plot takes its inspiration from Bacon's Rebellion in 1676, when, in the words of the novel, an army of blacks, natives, whites, mulattoes, freedmen, slaves, and indentured waged war against the local gentry led by members of that very class. By reopening that past, Morrison discloses the different forms of bondage that defined life for poor women and men, black, white, and indigenous, in the early centuries of the modern era, and the contingencies through which racial categories were created and fixed. A Mercy's connective thread is the story of Florence, an enslaved child born to an African mother on a Portuguese plantation in Maryland. She is acquired by an Anglo-Dutch farmer, Jacob Vark, as partial payment for a debt. While Vark is introduced to the reader as an upstanding individual who's uncomfortable with scenes of slavery and the decadence of plantation life, flesh was not his commodity, the narrator says. He's also a master to an entire household of people. His English wife, Rebecca, Lena, a native woman whose community has been decimated by smallpox, Sorrow, a young woman of ambiguous racial origins, and two indentured servants, Willard and Scully. Like most of Morrison's novels, the story of A Mercy is not straightforwardly told. The narrative perspective alternates, tacking between Florence's story, which she tells in the present tense, and third-person accounts of the other characters' lives. There are many narrative elements worth examining, but I want to focus on a small selection of moments in the novel that crystallize how Morrison speaks back to what Barnard Hesse calls a Western narrative of freedom that incorporates the imperatives of the colonizers and exercises the predicaments of the colonized and enslaved. I consider what A Mercy reveals about how modern life begins with slavery and what that implies for thinking about freedom today. First, I draw on Morrison's account of critical geography to explore the routes by which Africans and Europeans made their way to North America, how they laid new maps over those already drawn by native peoples, and how they conceived their own prospects in a strange land. Then I look at A Mercy as a meditation on modern subjectivity, asking how the characters' varied racial backgrounds and degrees of subjection lay bare the difficult work involved in freeing or even creating oneself in a world shaped by slavery. And finally, I return to the beginning, asking how we might think anew about the claim that modern life begins with slavery. In her 1992 book, Playing in the Dark, Morrison sketches an approach to American literature that she calls critical geography. She declares her intention is to use that map to open as much space for discovery, intellectual adventure, and close exploration, as did the original charting of the New World without the mandate for conquest. And this is actually one of, I think, the great features of Morrison's novels, is that she is attempting to take on what she sees as the inspiring dimensions of the creation of new worlds and new forms of freedom, but to imagine how that might be possible without requiring the subjection of others, whether they are people already living on the land or people who were transported there and enslaved. This imaginative undertaking stands in stark contrast to another way of narrating Atlantic voyages. The overweening defining event of the modern world, Morrison writes, is the mass movement of race populations, beginning with the largest forced transfer of people in the history of the world, slavery. Morrison's point is not simply to juxtapose two forms of passage, one freely undertaken and the other not, but to guide us in reading them together. Like many of her novels, A Mercy is a migration tale, but it reworks a genre associated in African American letters with movements out of and sometimes back to the South to encompass a variety of possible trajectories in the formative moments of the racial contract. The plot unfolds in places as far apart as London, West Africa, the American wilderness, Barbados, Virginia, and Maryland. It is both transatlantic and hemispheric, where Anna Brickhouse astutely reads the novel as a rejoinder to the false antagonism of territorial and oceanic imaginations in American literary history. I propose that it challenges an impoverished geography of political theories that do not embed their claims in European projects of expansion, encounter, conquest, capture, and theft. A Mercy thus provides one way to reorient political thought by replacing monological or geographically unspecific accounts of discovery and of the emergence of democracy. Think here of John Locke's In the Beginning, All the World Was America, with situated stories told in many voices about both the allure and the underside of modern freedom. A Mercy mostly unfolds in the Western Hemisphere, but ties to Africa never vanish. Indeed, in Morrison's novels, Africa is sometimes figured as a place of origin, or a source of a foundational mythology, or a site of possible challenges to the predatory freedom she associates with whiteness and the West. Although characters born in Africa typically make only brief appearances in her fiction, they often have a profound impact on her plots. Morrison is alert to the dangers of making too much of a fractured diasporic connection, but she does not underestimate its power. And here I quote, "Obviously, a strong identification of Black people from all over the world with each other, forced, awkward, or sentimental as it may be at first, is as frightening a thought to racism as the gathering of the poor of all nations under one compelling idea is to imperialism." In this spirit, A Mercy lays bare some of the connective tissues tying Black and white migrants to an Africa through which their experience of North America acquires its meaning. So the first account or first reference we get to Africa is offered by Senhor d'Ortega, who's a Portuguese enslaver. During a stifling dinner on his plantation, he reflects on his own biography and his time in what he calls the Angola part of Portugal. And he goes on to say it is the most amiable, beautiful land. D'Ortega's mapping transforms African territory and peoples into a playground of European design, a space where the magic of capital could transform the herding of cattle without much effort into the herding of human life. But this is not the only imagined Africa to appear in A Mercy. Florence, who has never been there, sees it as a romantic place where Black craftsmen practiced traditional arts back and back for 1,000 years. In contrast, her mother, who can remember life in Africa before the Middle Passage, recounts a history of patriarchal wars that eventually led to the burning of homes and the sale of herself and others to the men who, in her words, had confusing skins. The novel tracks different circuits of commerce and misery that brought both African and European characters to the Western Hemisphere, but the telling is always shadowed by and acquires its power in relation to the Middle Passage. When Rebecca, the English wife who has been purchased by Jacob Vark, reflects on her own miserable voyage, and indeed it does sound miserable, she notes the imperviousness of the sea to human design or control. The world beneath you, she says, is both a graveyard and a heaven. But whose graveyard and which heaven? Rebecca's journey is wretched and dangerous, but it pales by contrast to African's transatlantic voyages. When Florence's mother recalls her own initiation into European unreason by the way of the slave ship, readers learn that the sea was both graveyard and heaven to African captives who died en route or jumped into the embrace of sharks to escape the death of slavery. Morrison's critical geography also disrupts narratives of American founding that isolate the story of the United States from other colonial histories. Writing against a common sense articulated by Alexis de Tocqueville that the Americans have no neighbors, Morrison situates colonial North America in a wider neighborhood of slave capitalism. In this light, the novel's frequent comparisons between Virginia and Barbados reorient the reader by yoking the birthplace of American democracy to the first fully matured slave society in the Americas. Similarly, A Mercy delivers a rebuke to canonized imageries of the New World as an empty land and to the erasure of genocide from narratives of founding. Lena, the novel's main indigenous character, remarks on the violence of the improvement that came with European settlers, noting that the construction of Jacob Vark's house, quote, distorted sunlight and required the death of 50 trees, close quote. Lena worries that the murderous folly of building a grand house to replace a good one will ruin everyone, settler, indigenous inhabitants, the land itself. She has, after all, witnessed the annihilation of her own way of life by the disease that accompanied European encroachment and the destruction of her village by fire. Countering depictions of America that are so familiar in modern political thought, Morrison portrays a wilderness that is full of signs of human busyness and exposes the fiction of forests untouched since Noah. When the reader first meets Jacob Vark, for instance, he is crossing a territory that has been inhabited by different tribes whose liberty has already been or will soon be erased by the newcomers' pursuit of their own. This is the account of Jacob crossing the land. Other than certain natives to whom it all belonged from one year to another, any stretch might be claimed by a church, controlled by a company, or become the private property of a royal's gift to a son or a favorite. Since land claims were always fluid, except for notations on bills of sale, he paid scant attention to new or old names of towns or forts, Fort Orange, Cape Henry, New Amsterdam, Wiltwyck. In his own geography, he was moving from Algonquin to Susquehanna via Chesapeake on through Lenape, since turtles had a lifespan longer than towns. In this scene, Vark appears to resist at least one feature of modern settler sensibilities, the violently palimpsestic process through which maps of modern freedom have been drawn over existing ways of inhabiting the land. Yet while he evinces a respect for the other prior inhabitants of what he calls this ad hoc territory, that recognition does not impede his aspiration to remake the land to suit his own desires. Even as he follows the paths of indigenous women and men and recounts the names of the nations that have preceded him, his rebirth is predicated on suppressing that history. Breathing the air of a world so new, almost alarming in its rawness and temptation, never failed to invigorate him, the narrator comments. Whether voyages to the Western Hemisphere or the encounters of African, European, and Native American peoples are narrated as catastrophe, adventure, or romance, one of the chief effects of such movement is the production of new kinds of people, new individuals. In her account of European flights out of the old world into the new, Morrison discerns the yearning for what she calls a kind of human dignity believed unprecedented in the world. This is the movement to the new world to be free. For the Americans who escaped from Europe, she continues, the attraction was of the clean slate variety, a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity not only to be born again, but to be born again in new clothes, as it were. The setting would provide new raiments of the self. To be sure, the conditions in which the central figures of Mercy arrive in the Atlantic colonies undercut any fantasy of clean slate newness. Yet each of them engages in a form of self-fashioning, intertwined with settlement and slavery. And so I want to say a little bit about the stories of three of these characters, Jacob Vark, Florence, and her mother. Where Vark's narrative of self-making mirrors features of the archetypal American colonist, Florence and her mother, like so many people who inhabit Morrison's books, lay bare the processes through which African-descended and other non-white people entered the modern as conscripts of Western civilization. Jacob Vark sees himself as a kind of self-reliant individual avant la lettre, a ratty orphan become landowner, a self-made man. He's able to transcend lowly beginnings and prosper in a world that allows him to confront a member of the Portuguese upper class and take the upper hand. A world in which, in his view, only things, not bloodlines or character, separated them. Vark's distaste for the savagery of slavery and for the material extravagance of the plantation do not, however, outweigh his sense that his independence should be marked with a fenced yard and a grand house of many rooms. Crucially, he never relinquishes his self-image as an opponent of the traffic in flesh. Neither his purchase of Lena, Florence, and Rebecca, nor his investments in a remote labor force in Barbados that make him wealthy, shake his sense of his own virtue and self-made character. He forgets that his successes in the sugar trade are preceded by failed experiments in farming in the American Northeast. He respects the Indian names of the lands across which he travels, but fails to reckon with the fact that what Lena calls the death feet of the Europes are his own, or that the monument to his accomplishment requires the clearing of forests and the transformation of native land into private property. Complicity is essential to his liberty. And Vark's sense of his identity, which is achieved through the unacknowledged work of slaves, is finally mirrored in the unfinished house where he dies, an example of what Morrison elsewhere calls the architecture of a new white man. Florence, who is a child of the New World, conceived in the violent gang rape of her mother, embodies another kind of modern selfhood. She defies easy classification. She has the hands of a slave and the feet of a Portuguese lady, and she's able to read and write in a context in which many free people remain illiterate. Florence's contradictory relationship to freedom furthermore complicates the trajectory familiar to readers of slave narratives in the US tradition. She's willing to give up any liberty she has to secure the love and protection of a blacksmith, a free black man who works on Jacob Vark's house. Yet when he rejects her, she demonstrates a capacity for independence by traveling unprotected through miles of wilderness. Unlike Frederick Douglass's famous fight with the slave breaker, Edward Covey, it is Florence's struggle with her lover that allows the birth of a new free self. Where Douglass sheds his identity as a bondsman, however, Florence stitches together the old and the new. I am become wilderness, she says, but I am also Florence, in full, unforgiven, unforgiving. No Ruth, my love, none. Hear me, slave, free, I last. Beyond her existential meditations on being free and unfree, Florence also ponders the terms of her ownership and the relationship of her humanity to the different kinds of laws that were at work in her world. To the blacksmith, she says, I know you cannot steal me nor wedding me. Neither one is lawful. What I know is that I wilt when you go, and am straight when mistress sends me to you. Being on an errand is not running away. So at a time in which freedom is so bound up with freedom of mobility, Florence is acutely aware that her mobility depends upon this letter from her white mistress authorizing her travel. Fluent in the emerging language of white rule, Florence continues, I am a thing apart. With a letter I belong and am lawful. And for those of you who've read W.B. Du Bois's Souls of Black Folk, I always think this line echoes a place in Du Bois's book where he describes Black Americans as a tertium quid between men and cattle, this idea of being a thing apart. The story of Florence's mother offers another vantage on the coming into being of New World people. Before racism and slavery were fused in law, her passage from life as a young woman in Africa to existence as a saleable being who, quote, as a black was purchased by Señor, taken out of the cane and shipped north to his tobacco plants, indicates how these violent lines of demarcation, black-white, slave-free, were already being formed and were foundational to the constitution of North American societies. Even as Florence's mother is transformed into what Achille Mbembe calls human objects, human commodities, human money, however, Morrison reminds readers that she's also a cosmopolitan, if not by choice. Florence's mother knows the features of African life before the skirmishes that fed the Atlantic trade. She knows what happens on the voyage across the Atlantic. She sees how slavery is practiced in the West Indies and in Maryland. She understands the pivotal role of sexual violence in producing a labor force and reproducing slavery. Although Florence's mother has very little room to maneuver, she's not wholly undone by her captivity or by the successive forms of brutalization she endures. As historian Stephanie Smallwood remarks, the African as immigrant was not an inevitable byproduct of the traffic in human commodities, but rather a creation of his or her arduous making. Morrison's narratives do not allow readers to forget that creativity, that self-making. Where her 1987 novel Beloved famously explores infanticide as a way of protecting a child from bondage, the enslaved mother of Mercy takes another route towards the creation of a different future for her daughter. Florence's mother exploits a system of credit that was itself a cornerstone of modern slavery to secure her daughter's to secure her daughter's escape from the Portuguese plantation to a different master. Knowing that, in her words, to be female in this place is to be an open wound that cannot heal even if the scars form, the festering is ever below. Florence's mother presses Vark to accept her daughter as partial payment for Dortega's debt. She hopes he will regard her as a human child. In this way, she inverts a process whereby the sale of enslaved human beings effaces kinship, and the act of offering Florence to Vark is not an abandonment. But neither is it really a choice in the sense of a free selection from available options. It's a desperate move and a canny calculation in a world where nothing adds up. As the novel's narrator muses, there is no protection, but there is difference. This is a grim freedom, if we can call it that, the act of claiming entitlement to a child at the very moment that title is relinquished. It reveals one of the pathways through which Black subjects have forged their own liberty and the incompleteness of those efforts. The novel also offers glimpses of others. Allusions to Bacon's Rebellion recall a moment of cross-racial solidarity before the passage of lawless laws tied slavery to race and put an end to workers' opportunities to band together and upend the power of the gentry. Indeed, Willard, one of the indentured servants employed by Vark, remembers what he calls those harder but more satisfying days in Virginia, when he worked in the company of 6 English, 1 native, 12 from Africa by way of Barbados. Yet there's a catch. As Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz observes, Bacon's Rebellion, so beloved by populist U.S. historians and those who search for the onset of racial servitude in the British colonies, wasn't simply an example of multiracial insurgency. It was, at its heart, a struggle over private ownership of native land, and the role it played in enlisting landless and poor whites in genocidal policies is often effaced by tales of a lost Black-white solidarity. There are interviews where Morrison appears to reinforce this kind of romantic reading of the cross-racial alliance. But the novel complicates the story of the People's War. by recalling that it entailed what the narrator calls the slaughter of opposing tribes and running the Carolinas off their land. In other words, Amercy reveals the rewards and elusiveness of modern freedom by bringing to life some of the varied ways that flawed human beings have emancipated themselves and each other, often under crushing circumstances and for a short time. We also see this in Florence's escape from captivity by a group of religious fanatics, which is enabled by a young white girl at great risk to herself. We see it too in the flourishing of Vark's household during his many absences. They become a self-made community of unmastered women who create a world together through trial and error. Ultimately, their freedom is dependent on the goodwill of Rebecca and Jacob Vark, and indeed without the Vark's protection, the women are always vulnerable to new forms of bondage. Female and illegal, they would be interlopers, squatters, subject to purchase, hire, assault, abduction, exile, the narrator says, if the Varks die. In the years before the laws concretized whiteness as property, in other words, Amercy rewrites modern freedom as something to be won in the teeth of conventions of ownership that were already being raised and gendered. Amercy is not the only novel of modern beginnings in Morrison's corpus. And in fact, I could really tell a different version of the story drawing on almost any of her 11 novels. In the book, I pair it with the novel Jazz in the chapter that talks about Amercy. Jazz focuses on the experiences of Black migrants from the rural South who escaped to New York City, or a city very much like it, in the early 20th century. But I think, as I said, almost all of Morrison's novels explore how modern life begins with slavery. Repeatedly, she returns to moments of founding, exposing from the inside the perspectives of women and men who are engaged in the world's remaking under adverse conditions. Through these practices of reconfiguration, she reveals how slavery and freedom are recreated in the establishment of communities, the dawn of new eras, and moments of legal and political transformation. Countering both the blithe progressivism of liberal histories and political theories and the melancholic attachment that many have to the past, Morrison's novels trace the fraught connections through which the Middle Passage and colonial conquest shape our present. To say that modern life begins with slavery, then, is to articulate the ways in which we remain captured by that centuries-long process of marrying human aspirations for freedom with racialized forms of human bondage and theft. The evidence of slavery's afterlives is legible in nearly every marker of well-being in the United States. In Americans' ongoing tolerance of official and private acts of anti-Black violence, in the structures of reward and punishment that place differential values on differently raised lives. But this is not the same as declaring the past is simply our present, because Morrison's enable readers to see the newness of each beginning is real. She offers something other than a vision of history that is monotonously repeated. Because her writing illuminates how ordinary people have often attempted to escape the conjunction of slavery and freedom, she offers a rich repertoire of practices from which alternative ways of living might be born. The liberty of the moderns, in Morrison's view, is only imaginable when we ask again and again what resources we have for conceiving forms of freedom not predicated on the subjugation of others. One clear answer is that it's not possible to understand freedom simply by transcending racial categories and gendered forms of power that have shaped modern life. As a novelist and a political thinker, one of Morrison's gifts to her readers is her capacity to bring to life the way those categories and forms of power have been experienced by crafting stories about women, men, and children whose lives they have shaped most profoundly. Embedded in those stories are loopholes, escape plots, and other challenges to the kinds of injustice we too often accept as inevitable or unchangeable. If we take seriously Morrison's claim that modern life begins with slavery, the irredeemable character of an originary horror does not bind us to its reenactment. There is no protection, but there is difference after all.